We really think European butter from France is the best butter, and our friend, the expert baker and best-selling cookbook author David Leibovitz, agrees. Check out our recent episode with David to find out how he cooks with quality butter. And for recipes, tips, and cooking advice, go to tasteeurope.com.
Spirits don't change. They're bottled history. They're liquid time capsules. So it's very exciting to taste something from the past. There's really not many things you can have from the past like that. You can't see what oranges tasted like in the 70s.
This is Taste. I'm your host, Matt Rodbard. Aaron Goldfarb has been a journalist for over a decade, frequently writing on the subject of cocktails and drinking culture for such publications as the New York Times, Playboy, and Taste. His latest book, Dusty Booze, In Search of Vintage Spirits, digs into our ongoing obsession with old spirits and the people who chase them. On this episode, we talk about the real bourbon grails and the fake ones, and if there is any remaining Stitzel-Weller juice to be drunk in this country. I did not think there was, but he has a great response. It's so fun catching up with Aaron, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Aaron Goldfarb, welcome to This Is Taste. What's up, buddy?
What's up, man?
It's good to see you. I've known you for a long time. When I was editing at Punch, I edited some of your stories there, and you've written for Taste. We're going to get to your story about the George Foreman Grill, which is a fan favorite.
Thank you.
But we were just chatting off, Mike. I want to make this official. You lost out in the audition for your audiobook. Like, you literally tried out to read your own book, and you didn't quite make the cut. What happened?
Yeah, so they were getting ready to do my audiobook, and they said, there's a lot of first-person perspective in this book, so it'd be good if you potentially read it. You're obviously not a pro, so record a little audition and send it in, and we'll make a decision. You want to get picked because you make like an extra $5,000 if that happens. Of course,
good.
You also sit in a studio for 3 straight days talking, which for a freelance writer who lives, with a cat all day, it's a lot.
You're like more of an iMac guy, not a microphone guy.
That's a lot of talking. Sent it in. I thought I did a pretty good job, and I got we've decided to go another direction.
Okay. Fair enough. I mean, there'll be other books, but the book we're talking about, Dusty Booze. Listen, bro, this is such a great book. I'm a huge fan of your writing, and working with you has always been a pleasure. What I like about this book is there's a lot of first person, as you mentioned. You've really got voice, but you've also got the chops to write about spirits. You write about craft beer, but mostly you write about spirits, and I just enjoy the journey. So we're going to get into Dusty Booze, and I feel like I want to get a sense from the jump about your own personal experience hunting for ultra vintage bottles of bourbon, chartreuse, Campari, yellow chartreuse, green chartreuse, all that shit. What is it like for you to hunt for Dusty Booze?
I've never been as huge and earnest of hunter as the people detailed in this. I first learned about the practice of looking for vintage spirits around 2013, and I said to myself, "Oh, every liquor store's probably cleared out by now." In the late aughts, early 2010s, this first kind of group of dusty hunters started going to out-of-the-way liquor stores, rural liquor stores in quote-unquote bad parts of town, and finding bottles from the 80s, 70s, 60s that had just sat on the shelf for 50 years and never been purchased for whatever reason. So I never was one of those people who printed out, a giant, Google map or MapQuest place to place and went around any town looking. But if I saw an estate sale, if I saw, an out of the way liquor store in a weird town, I would go in, and by then I knew the things to look for to determine why an old granddad was from the 70s and not from 2015 or whatever. In Europe, I've had a decent amount of luck because at least until recently, they didn't really care about vintage spirits as much as we do here. They didn't have as many dorks obsessed with going around and clearing out liquor stores as much as we had here. And so, I found a lot of Vintage Amaro in Rome a few years back.
Oh, cool. And I mean, let's zoom out a little and just like set the table a bit about what this all means. And I think we can start with bourbon. You really focus on, Kentucky bourbon and American whiskey as well in the first half of the book. But I want to build this kind of narrative, and for our audience, this is really interesting. And if you drink, if you don't drink, this is history. We're talking about liquid that was produced 50 years ago, 60 years ago, even 30 years ago, even 10 years ago, and it's limited. We drink it, it's done. And I think you have kind of articulated this well, but what is it that's so interesting about vintage bourbon?
Well, I think a lot of people know with wine, it ages in the bottle. Doesn't always age better, but in a lot of cases, it does. So if you have an old bottle, it's turned into something else. Spirits don't change. They're bottled history. They're liquid time capsules. So to open a 1960s gin is to be able to make a martini like Don Draper might have had it, if he was a real person, obviously. So it's very exciting to taste something from the past. There's really not many things you can have from the past like that. You can't see what oranges tasted like in the 70s, Bourbon is just what people are most obsessed with in the spirits world, so it only made sense that vintage bourbon was the first category people started to pursue. A lot of the great distilleries from the past no longer exist, so to taste a Weller from 1960s was to taste something from a distillery called Stitzel Weller that hasn't been open since 1992. To taste Old Grandad from the 70s was to taste it from a distillery called National Distillers, which no longer exists. To taste Wild Turkey from the 80s was to taste a bourbon made under different kind of production practices than Wild Turkey is made today. And, maybe you'll like it better. A lot of people do, myself included, but it's going to be different.
That's interesting. And I think it's so key to point out again, these are not getting quote unquote better with time. These aren't their bottle aging is kind of a myth, but we're talking about a production and a practice at a time when industrialization was maybe a little different. Obviously water quality was different. So can you say that we'll say the Stitzel Weller juice, and we've talked about alcohol produced at this mythical Stitzel Weller. Kentucky is where bourbon is made. It's exclusive to that is the law. So we're talking about a very limited amount of geography where bourbon is made. And the Stitzel Weller distillery is so mythic. But is it the Stitzel Weller juice? Is it better?
I think a lot of people would say it is. And I happen to kind of think it is as well. Why it's better, what occurred to make it better than anything today is certainly up for debate. In other spirits categories, that's not necessarily up for debate. We can say, old tequila was made with more mature agave than they're using today. But with bourbon, there's lots of factors. Was the corn of a better quality than the kind of mass-produced government-funded corn today? Were the oak barrels of a better quality back then? They say they were made out of oak trees that were 170 years old. Today, oak barrels are apparently made from trees that are about 80 years old. Was the fermentation different? Wild Turkey used to ferment in open cedar tanks. You have to wonder if a sort of microflora got into the walls of those tanks and kind of affected the signature flavor of 80s Wild Turkey. Nowadays, everything's stainless steel, computer operated, virtually impossible to screw up. It's flawlessly made. It's always good, but I'm not sure it's as interesting as stuff from the past.
There's those little bit of defects, a little bit of those variants, the variables that make something extraordinary versus just plain good.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Pappy Van Winkle, Stitzel Weller's most famous production. And I feel like there was a moment when I started writing about spirits and cocktails in, I'd say around 2005. And I'm sure it goes way, way back, but Pappy Van Winkle, obviously, we all know what that is. It had a moment. What does Pappy Van Winkle mean to this whole narrative?
Well, it depends if you're talking about the man or the brand.
Let's talk about the guy with the cigar on the label.
Okay, that's Pappy Van Winkle Sr.
Yeah,
Julian Van Winkle Sr., called Pappy. He was a bourbon salesman who opened the Stitzel Weller distillery in 1935 on Kentucky Derby Day. He was kind of a salesman par excellence in an era before people were kind of trying to hype up bourbon. So in a way, it's only fitting the most hyped up bourbon of this era is named after him. He made a wheated bourbon, which was unusual for the era. If you didn't know, all bourbon has to be at least 51% corn, but then distilleries typically choose a second grain to add flavor and complexity.
And made in Kentucky, right?
It doesn't have to be made in Kentucky, actually, just the U.S.
Just the U.S., okay.
Yeah. He chose wheat, which was very unusual, adds a kind of sweeter, more caramely note, a more perhaps palatable or approachable bourbon. And when it's well-aged with a little bit of proof, it's quite delicious.
All right. I mean, I feel like the actual juice, the alcohol that's in the bottle around this period in 2005 became coveted.
Yes.
Is there like a moment in maybe media history where Pappy Van Winkle, with the number on the bottle, like 21, right? Is 21?
There's a 15, 20, and 23.
Right, 23 is the one I knew there's an odd number. So like 23 became like, and as part of your narrative of Dusty Hunting, when 23 became this kind of very collectible whiskey.
Yeah, well, so, Julian Van Winkle Sr. dies in, I think, the 60s, but Stitzel-Weller makes it to 1992. 1992 plus 23 years old, that brings Stitzel-Weller liquid all the way to 2015. So Pappy Van Winkle bottles up to 2015 were Stitzel-Weller liquid. Today they're not. And that kind of became a demarcation point for, when it went from absolutely spectacular to just very good, I guess. But yeah, I think I usually place it around 2010 when the, Cognoscente really starts becoming obsessed with Pappy. Around then, Bourdain starts drinking it.
Sean Brock,
yeah.
Yeah, great chef in Charleston and in Nashville, started famously collecting, bourbon and using eBay. I know you write about that, about using online forums to buy bourbon and whiskeys. Yeah,
he became one of the premier, if not the premier collector of old Stitzel-Weller bourbons from the entire era. I think in an episode of Bourdain's show, he famously carried around a unlabeled jug of it all night through Charleston as him and Bourdain hit the Waffle House and whatnot. That kind of supercharged it into the mainstream of it. That's when, every liquor store, I'm sure will tell you, they were getting all the phone calls asking if they had it. No, of course they didn't.
The word allocation came into our
yes.
lexicon. Everyone's talking about allocation. It's like my friend literally went to that liquor store in Red Hook that had allocation.
Yeah, Linnell's.
No, I'm talking about, Linnell's is amazing. We have it for another conversation. No, there's, maybe it's more like, it's like right by the 9th Street subway station. There was a big,
okay, yeah, I know.
Like in like near I would call it a Staples.
Yeah.
And there's a big liquor store, and they had like allocation back in 2005. Anyways, this is my friend's story with Pappy, but everyone had their like secret allocation spots, right?
Yeah, those I think have mostly dried up. There's just too many people that want it. I mean, I think if you've been a good customer of it for many years, maybe your liquor store will throw you a favor. But, the almighty dollar usually dictates they'll charge as much as they can.
Of course. Now, I want to talk about, we talk about bourbon and whiskeys in like this coveted sense. There's a high demand around 2000, 2001. But this wasn't always the case. Going back just a few years, 1987, Jim Beam pays $545 million to National Distillers to acquire a peach schnapps company because the Fuzzy Navel was like the 9th most popular cocktail at the time, which is amazing. You write about it very colorfully. But like kind of thrown into the deal is Old Grandad, Old Taylor, Old Crow, and Rye, Old Overholt, and they're thrown into this deal. So my question is, back in the 80s, bourbon and whiskey was like not exciting, not cool, not what people were drinking.
Yeah, I mean that's still one of the most amazing deals to me. It's like trading for so-and-so and tossed in on the deal also is, Kevin Durant and whatnot. Yeah, I mean, if you've seen Cocktail, this is what people were drinking. They weren't drinking bourbon, from Tom Cruise's
Fine film from 1988.
fine film. Yeah, yeah, they drinking these sweet spirits. They were drinking clear spirits like vodka, unaged tequila, maybe a little gin, maybe Bacardi, and then a lot of sweet stuff like schnapps. Sex on the Beach was huge. Fuzzy Navels you mentioned, and then a lot of cocktails with unsavory names.
Yeah, exactly. Very canceled cocktails.
Right,
Extremely
exactly.
canceled. Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, no one was drinking Old Granddad. No one was drinking Old Crow. Certainly no one was drinking Old Overholt, a rye. No one even knew what rye
From
was.
Pennsylvania, of all places, right?
Right, exactly.
Sorry, Clayton, about that. Yeah, love Pennsylvania.
So yeah, it was kind of tossed in on a deal, and I don't know what exec pulled that off, but he ended up making an incredible score of incredible bourbons and ryes that are massive today.
Yeah. So later on, all of these distilleries would become truly the dusty bottles that you're hunting for, upwards of $5,000 a bottle. Is this the glut era? Is that what you're referring to, or is that a different era? Because you refer to the glut era, and I think that's an interesting phrasing. Like, what is the glut era?
Yeah, and that's not a term I coined. That's standard industry parlance. I think it's around 1970, the bourbon industry, for the first time in decades, since Prohibition, I think, in fact, starts having sales going downhill. Kids of the 70s start to see bourbon as kind of an old man's drink. And so from 1970 all the way up to, I think, 1999, every single year bourbon sales go down year after year after year. And at a certain point you start going, well, why the hell are they still making so much bourbon if no one's buying it? And I asked Eddie Russell, who's the master distiller of Wild Turkey, why were you continuing to make millions of bottles of bourbon a year if no one was buying it? And, he kind of said to make bourbon, you have to have faith in the future. Because if you're selling a product that is going to be sold at 12 years of age, 15 years of age, with Pappy, we said 23 years of age, you can't think about the current consumer. You have to think about the future consumer. And these Kentucky bourbon men were certain that, 5, 10, 30 years from now, people are again going to be buying bourbon. They were very close to putting themselves out of business, but this gambit has eventually paid off.
Yeah.
Those 30 years were not very good years for the industry, very dark years when, as you said, peach schnapps was what everyone was drinking, and they were very uncool in Kentucky, but they got through with a few kind of gimmicks through this era.
I mean, like Four Roses, I hear the story back in like the 80s and 90s. Like they were producing it in Kentucky, but it was like below. It was like they couldn't sell Four Roses. Like it was
they weren't even. They got to a point where they quit making straight bourbon. Straight bourbon is, as we said, distilled corn, essentially barreled in oak barrels. They started making a blended whiskey, which was bourbon mixed with essentially just grain alcohol. Pretty disgusting. So this once venerable brand was just selling absolute junk. So uninformed dusty hunters have found a old Four Roses bottle and thought, wow, I found a great score, and it's, absolutely gross stuff. But Four Roses eventually got back on track thanks to the Japanese market.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was curious about, how like there was like a level of like just kind of cutting corners and making shit, and bourbon just didn't have demand. And let's segue into Japan. It's an important place in bourbon history. The Beam Suntory deal went down, and Fred Noe, you got to give him some credit and his family for making that happen. I've got to spend some time with Fred a few times, and I enjoy his company and hearing about the family history. But how does Japan's thirst for whiskey and bourbon kind of drive America back into the game?
Yeah, so from what I understand and from what I've talked to people in the 80s, Japan had a real thirst for kind of classic Americana, whether it was an Americana that actually really existed here or was kind of just seen on TV. They loved Levi's and Coca-Cola and cheeseburgers and bourbon. So it became a lifeline to Kentucky distillers who couldn't sell anything here. In fact, it became better than a lifeline because here they were selling, very standard bourbon, and the Japanese crowds asked for elevated luxury bourbon. Can you bottle 15-year-old bourbon? Can you bottle 20-year-old bourbon? The Kentucky distillers said, well, that's ridiculous. Bourbon is not palatable at that many years of age.
Wow.
It would taste
Amazing.
like oak. Yes, right. But whatever, if you want to, buy this 20-year-old barrel that I can't give away in America, I am glad to sell it to you. So by then we have Julian Van Winkle III, Pappy's grandson, who now owns the company. His father and his grandfather are dead, and he's doing anything he can to move barrels of whiskey. He's got a lot of Stitzel-Weller stock, and he starts traveling to Japan and selling them barrels. Blanton's famously starts in Japan. They're looking for a luxury product, a kind of American version of single malt. The producers of Blanton's Ancient Age was the name at the time. Buffalo Trace is now it. Came to them. What if we give you a single barrel bourbon? Each bottle individually comes from a single barrel of bourbon,
right? Which is common in parlance now for bourbon,
right.
Used very well and famously by plenty of producers. But this was not known. This was not thought about. There was no like numbers on barrels in single barrel bourbon.
Yeah. Exactly. It came in the same kind of luxury bottle we see today with the horse topper. This was not something the American bourbon market had ever seen. And this was kind of the start of finally getting out of the glut. Finally, American distilleries started going, wow, these Japanese drinkers like Four Roses as bourbon, not blended bourbon. These Japanese drinkers like this Blanton's, which I think sold for about $90 US at the time over there, an outrageous number. These Japanese drinkers like this 20-year-old Stitzel-Weller, which must have given Julian Van Winkle the idea, maybe I can rename it Pappy Van Winkle and start selling it in America. And Japan really helped give ideas to American distillers, which would eventually turn around the market in America.
So interesting, Japan. And I have a follow-up question about Japan, but as an aside, it's really interesting about the Japanese custom of drinking bourbon, which is like highball with water. So it's not even the way we think about drinking antique spirits, which is neat and slowly. What does that affect the way that Japan has a thirst for bourbon, the way it's served?
Well, I've also been told in the 80s, there was not a lot of drinking done at home. People didn't get a bottle at the liquor store and take it home. They'd kind of like bottle service is known in America, but these weren't clubs. These were, kind of just whiskey bars. You'd buy a whole bottle of Blanton's for your crew and go through it out the night. Maybe some people drank it neat. Maybe some people had it on ice. Maybe some people had it as a highball, as you said. I think the distillers in America were happy that you drank it anyway.
Yeah,
if you want
totally.
to mix it with Coke, that's fine too. But yeah, that really gave a lifeline to America.
Now, the Beam Suntory merger or Suntory acquiring Beam happens in 2014. So there's there's some economics at play where Japan is investing heavily in American production. At the same time, Japan is starting to have its own domestic bourbon and whiskey scene where brands like Yamazaki are starting to enter the fray. And I recall Japanese whiskey being, while bourbon from like Stitzel-Weller was coveted, Japanese whiskey was almost like frowned upon around the 2014, 2013 era. And you couldn't, give away some of these spirits. Yamazaki 12, you could buy, or 10, or whatever it may be, you could like find in stores. And fast forward to 2024, and you can't find a Japanese whiskey with a number on it. It's very difficult.
Yeah. The American whiskey collector, if not the world whiskey collector, is always looking for the next thing. So, who knows what the next thing will be. But you're right. Around that era, these Japanese whiskeys, most notably Yamazaki, which is produced by Suntory, started getting accolades, winning kind of awards. Famously, I can't remember what year it was. A Yamazaki was named Whiskey of the Year by Jim Murray, who's a since canceled producer of whiskey reviews.
Yeah.
And that really lit a fire. It got a lot of viral articles, and then all of a sudden, you could find. Yamazaki 12 went from something you could find anywhere to impossible to find, and Yamazaki 18 catapulted to like $500 a bottle. Same thing that happened.
Which is is that today, or is it even more today? Yamazaki, if you can even find it.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to even market price these things because you just don't even see them. Maybe a 12. I can't recall the last time I saw an 18. They released a 55, Yamazaki 55-year-old 2 years ago, which I think sold for about $1 million on auction.
Yeah, it's amazing to see the Japanese market. I remember going to a launch lunch for Yamazaki 10 or Yamazaki 12, and it like they were giving away bottles, obviously. And I remember someone smart in the room said at that time, and I remember it was like a weird, like it was like John George. It was like seeing Yamazaki and John George together is always an interesting dynamic. But they were like, if you can find Japanese whiskey with a number on it,
Yeah.
doesn't matter what it is, buy every bottle you can find. You probably would have been a safe bet back then.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and Japanese whiskey famously had only existed as blends till I think about 1985 when they started releasing a 12-year-old. So there wasn't a lot of stock in the back to go into. And the blended Japanese whiskey fit very well with their highball culture. This new single malt culture of the last 40 years has really elevated the profile of Japanese whiskey outside of just a local sensation to a world sensation.
Back to dusty hunting. Can you still find bottles now? Like today, 2024, can you like go and find on a shelf something that has value?
Well, maybe not bourbon, but perhaps something, because what people covet is always changing. 3 years ago, you could have said, I'm done looking for bourbon. Maybe I'll go look for old chartreuse, perhaps find that. People now are perhaps looking for old tequilas, obscure Amaro. So there's always something that's kind of going up in value. And then 5 years from now, we go, damn, why didn't I just start looking for chartreuse in 2018 or whatever? So there's always something. The liquor stores are mostly picked throughout at least America. So you got to start being a little more creative.
Where would you start if you were like in a city that you hadn't been to? Let's make up a city. Let's say Topeka, Kansas. I'm saying the center of the country, not too far from Kentucky. Where are you looking for vintage spirits and dusty bottles?
It's kind of one of those things where you're road tripping and you pass and you're like, that is a weird place for a liquor store. We should pull over. If it ever gives you a little unease or like, is this place actually open? That might work. Estate sales have become a big thing. Yeah. There's always some old person dying that no one knew had a ton of bottles in their attic or basement. So there's always new bottles entering the market. It's gotten a little more commoditized into auction markets and whatnot. The days of making insane scores are somewhat thinning out, but they still happen.
So speaking of old people, before we started recording, I showed you a photo of a bottle that was it was my grandfather's bottle, and he died in 99. And my uncle had kind of inherited his bottles and this box. I remember vividly because in 1999 I was 19 years old and I was drinking out of these bottles myself because I was like, this is like Grandpa has some old, Grandpa Pat has some old bottles. But in this collection, and he was a well-read dude. He like definitely traveled a lot. He wasn't a big drinker, but I definitely think he liked to entertain. And in this box was this bottle that I showed you. And I was like curious. We had it was empty now, but 2 Thanksgivings ago it was about a quarter full. What was that bottle? I'm just like, from my own personal history, what was in there?
That's the famous Gold Vein from the Stitzel-Weller distillery. They call it Gold Vein because it has these little gold veins going through the neck of the bottle. It's a really attractive bottle. I've never actually tried it, but it sells for a ton on the markets these days, and I understand it's some of the most delicious vintage bourbon ever made. You would know, but then again, you were drinking it when you were 19.
Yeah, so. I might have had a nip of it when I was 19. I don't drink, so I didn't try it when we were discovering it 2 years ago. It says it was barreled in 1951 on the bottle.
Oh wow, okay, so that might be worth like 10,000 plus or something.
Yeah, so filled that would have been like 10K.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm keeping the bottle. I like the bottle. It is a very short
Yeah,
bottle.
it's a great looking bottle. Yeah.
Well, thanks for playing Antiques Roadshow for a second. I appreciate
I'm sure people will write into the show and tell I was off by several thousand.
Yeah,
And I'm a moron and whatnot.
No, you're doing your best.
Yeah, people get really mad at value of bottles. So
Okay, well, those people should maybe chill because like this is kind of fun.
I know.
Let's talk about Sesame DeMille. You write about a tip you received about a collection from a famous director. You kind of unwind it a bit in this beautiful introduction. It's a really great book. Dusty Boo's writing is so crisp. I'm giving a few as gifts. But what do you find out from Cecil B. DeMille's booze collection?
Yeah, so this guy reached out to me early in the pandemic, just over Instagram. I didn't know him. His name was Kevin Langdon Ackerman, and he said, I just found Cecil B. DeMille's booze collection. He was both, interestingly enough, not Cecil B. DeMille, Kevin, a Dusty hunter and a Hollywood memorabilia collector. So this was really in his wheelhouse. I'm both into vintage spirits and Hollywood as well, so it was also in my wheelhouse. He just got a call one day from someone loosely in the business. She said she was on Cecil B. DeMille's old ranch north of Los Angeles. The newest homeowner who had just bought it from a previous homeowner had opened like kind of a bomb shelter type thing. And there had been an incredible amount of bottles in there. Based on the writing, almost certainly was DeMille's collection. You know, Kevin tossed aside his breakfast and sped up there and found an absolutely remarkable collection. DeMille was a famous entertainer of old Hollywood. He was one of the earliest legends of Hollywood. 10 Commandments, Big Top, lots of famous movies from both the silent film era into the earliest talkie era. And he had a massive booze collection, bourbons, gins, great old rums, wines, and Kevin was able to acquire this all.
Wow. So the yarn is that he was able to negotiate a price. Did you ever get the price?
I know about the price, and I think for tax purposes, I'm not allowed to.
You're not allowed to say, but I would imagine it's in the six figures.
I think its value might be that high, but I think he might have got it in the mid 5 figures.
Okay, well, cool. Well, I mean, we don't need to dwell on that point, but I think it's just part of the way Dusty spirits kind of play with pop culture, because collecting alcohol is certainly not just wine, but all sorts of spirits is like it's a part of being a celebrity. You have a cellar, you have like great things to drink, and I feel there's probably, if you drive around Palm Springs, I'm sure there's some other Dusty bins in that town.
Yeah, well, one of the other through lines of this book, the DeMille collection was found. One of the through lines of the book is Kevin looking for his next score, which he's heard that when Howard Hughes died in 1976, his office was sealed at 7000 Romaine in Los Angeles, and his office was full of booze. That building still exists. It's only been under 2 owners since then. And so for a lot of the book, he's trying to figure out how he can get in there and perhaps acquire the collection. I also became obsessed with figuring out how I could perhaps find this collection as well. I can spoil it if you want, or make you read the book.
No, let's not
find out.
Let's not spoil it. I think let's definitely. And I'm linking to the book in the show notes. Buy this book. It's terrific. And if you have any interest in American history and just like booze and cocktails, this is the one. I want to get into non-bourbon a little bit. You mentioned and touched on it, but there's definitely a movement of yellow chartreuse, aged. We talk about other spirits. First question is, why is there so little vintage tequila available?
Well, that was a question I asked myself at a certain point. You've written books. You ask, am I getting repetitive? Am I talking too much about bourbon? So one day I asked myself, I wonder, are there vintage tequila collectors out there? I'd never met one. So I spent the day searching for them, and I found a very interesting community of them that honestly taught me a lot more than vintage bourbon collectors taught me. The short answer is that America hasn't had a love affair with tequila as long as it's had a love affair with bourbon. The tequila world hasn't exported as much tequila as bourbon did. Tequila only really became super prominent in America, 100% agave tequila, till the early 80s. And the tequila world was 100% Mexican owned till I think the early 90s. So there was no conglomerate kind of commoditizing, getting it out into the place. It was still kind of a quiet spirit that people didn't know much about. That's hard to believe now in a world where it's about to overtake, I think, both vodka and bourbon as the preeminent spirit in America. But drinking vintage tequila, I learned, takes you back to a world that doesn't exist, where, you know, some of these distilleries didn't have electricity till the 80s. El Tesoro, which is also owned by Jim Beam, and some people think made the best tequila ever in the 80s and early 90s before they were acquired by Jim Beam. They didn't have electricity. Everything was done by hand. Everything was done on old machinery. It was very rustic and artisanal, kind of how you might see mezcal made today at tiny palancas. So it's very interesting, even if you're not a drinker, as you mentioned, to look back at how these spirits used to be made and what they could teach us about cultures and places and how the world operated before, giant companies kind of screwed it all up.
Yeah, the giant companies with like billions of dollars at play here. And let's go to Italy and talk about, and we can talk a little bit of Fernet Branca, but also vintage Campari. And it's interesting. To me, it doesn't seem like the flavor profile would change much, but the big point about Campari is that was it 2015 or 2005? The red coloring was actually created by insects, right? Is that a myth? I always wondered if
that's true. And I think there's still a few countries that don't allow artificial dyes, like maybe Spain, where they still do use the bugs. I think they're called cochinos. This is why I didn't get the audiobook gig. But yeah, and the difference between liqueurs and Campari, like Campari and Chartreuse compared to spirits, is that is the one vintage that actually changes in the bottle because of the sugar content.
Oh, right on. Cool.
So a vintage Chartreuse or a vintage Campari, vintage Fernet, the sugars kind of crystallize, kind of become a little syrupy, perhaps. Some botanicals are going to fade out. Some might raise. So that's the one that changes a bit as opposed to bourbon, tequila, rum.
I remember writing about Billy Sunday in Chicago and like looking at serial numbers on yellow Chartreuse and I was like, is this what I want to be doing with my life? That's more about me, but respect, and that's a joke because I really do respect anyone like yourself who has such a passion and knowledge about craft spirits. But it seems like it does change. There is a market for yellow Chartreuse.
Yeah, well, I mean, the monks famously announced last year that they're tired of being chartreuse makers. They just want to be monks, and we need to start buying less chartreuse, and they're going to send us less. And
interesting,
and that kind of went viral. And then they went and opened their own brick and mortar store in Paris. So I don't know, maybe they're capitalists like us all.
Yeah.
But chartreuse is probably second only to bourbon in the vintage collectors hierarchy.
I have to ask you about vintage NA. I'm thinking Josta, which was a soda that was made between the years of 1997 and 1998. There's a few bottles available on eBay. I'm thinking Crystal Pepsi. I'm thinking Old Fanta and Faygo. I'm thinking of bottles of Mountain Dew from the 1980s. Is there like a scene of NA vintage collectors?
What about Surge?
Sick.
Surge?
I in fact, I know about Surge. I actually got some second gen Surge sent to me in 2011 back at an old job when they brought it back for a year.
Yeah.
Good call on the Surge like that.
I've never investigated whether there's vintage NA, but non-alcoholic for you all out there.
Totally.
But I've learned as a journalist, there's collectors of everything. I've written about Monster Energy drink collectors who collect vintage Monster Energy drink. They don't drink it; they just collect it.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if there's vintage soda collectors. I haven't detailed them, but there's always more books to write.
Yeah, maybe more articles to write, like Taste again. Let's go there.
I haven't had that Josta though. I need to try.
Josta is like
is that a local soda?
No. This was a PepsiCo product. It had the guarana berry in it, which was it was basically the first energy drink commercially.
Yeah, that's what's in Red Bull. Right?
Exactly. It was what's in Red Bull, but it was a different flavor profile, and it was a cola-ish soda called Josta.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a Wikipedia and definitely
might have my next story.
I love it. So I know Crystal Pepsi turns dark after time.
I'll drink almost anything. I don't know if I would drink vintage soda. I drank a vintage Billy beer
Okay.
fairly recently from 1981, and I'm still here to.
Was that for like some video content, or you just did it for fun?
I had one, and I was with some beer people, and I thought, well, let's open this vintage Billy beer.
I love it. Well, we'll have you back to talk about beer, Aaron. This has been really fun. On This Is Taste, we ask guests about their discerning taste. So to close this interview, here's a little rapid fire, fast and furious taste check. Are you ready?
I think so.
The best beer.
Oh, not Billy beer. It's something different every day. I'd say Rathaus Pilsner,
Where's that from?
Germany, Black Forest.
Black Forest. The worst spirit.
The worst spirit is any collab spirit with like some fast food company, like a Arby's vodka or something.
Yeah, Doritos vodka.
I'm sick of that crap.
Yeah, it's not that interesting, I'm sure, for someone who studies it.
It's just like lame viral bait.
Well, is there a category though? I'm just like pushing you just to shit.
I don't know. Vodka's pretty uninteresting.
Yeah,
that's an obvious answer. I wish I had a better answer.
It's not really that obvious. We don't talk about it, and like it's obviously maybe not in the vintage game as much.
Well, that's another one. I started asking, some buyers and sellers because vintage dealing is legal in a few states now, and they said, we're moving on to vintage vodka because if we open brick and mortar vintage cocktail bars, your people are going to come in for the vintage Negronis, and they're going to have the one friend who only drinks vodka. Well, we have to serve them a vintage vodka martini. So It even has a bit of a market. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's going to be definitely markets for all the vintage spirits. Your favorite American bar?
Well, most spirits writers say Long Island Bar, which might be my favorite bar. I'll give a shout out to Travel Bar in Carroll Gardens, which is a great little neat whiskey tasting bar.
That's really fun. I used to live like 2 blocks from
Oh, yeah?
That's
Nice.
great. I love that call. Your favorite non-American bar?
I love this bar in Rome called Mache. It's like its full name has like 10 Italian words, and I can never remember the full name, but Mache is what people call it. It's like it's small. It's like half the size of this podcast studio, and there's like 3 seats to sit, and it's mostly like old Italian guys smoking cigarettes and watching bad Italian soccer. But they have an insane beer list at all times. They always have Cantillon on tap. But people don't go there to like be beer geeks. They just go there to hang out and drink, and you get your beer and you go stand outside on the street and smoke cigarettes and get nearly hit by Vespas. And you just have a great time. It's my platonic ideal of a neighborhood bar.
Are you going to open a bar one day?
If someone will fund it.
Hey man, is it good business?
I feel like people ask me like if I'd like to open a bar, and the question is yes, if I don't have to put in my money or put any work. And I'm just like, but no one's gonna let someone open a bar like who's like, well, I like to go to bed at 9:30.
Right.
I don't really like to clean dishes. I don't have any money to provide, and so
you have books though.
I have books.
Books, man.
Travel Bar's kind of like the kind of bar I would open. He just has curated a nice list, and he has locals, and it's kind of the bar he'd like to run, and but so he's already got Travel Bar. So
have you ever consulted on a menu? Have you ever done any of that work?
No, I don't think.
Listeners out there, this is the guy. I mean, for real. I feel like that $5,000 for the book money could come back. Maybe being on this podcast and the consulting money seems like a good price.
Yeah, I think I'd like to consult on an airline menu too.
Yeah, I think it's going to happen. Your favorite cocktail?
I'm a Tommy's Margarita fan.
Really? What is that? I don't know what that is.
That's
I have no idea.
That's a margarita traditionally has orange liqueur, which I kind of think's gross. So a Tommy's Margarita just swaps in agave syrup as
cool.
Sweetener. It was created by this guy Julio Bermejo at Tommy's restaurant in San Francisco. And it's just a nice, clean, refreshing cocktail.
I always wondered that the orange, which is a couple brands, would always figure out their way to get into cocktails.
It doesn't even make sense. They're not Mexican ingredients either.
I know. They're usually from France.
Yeah.
Interesting. Your favorite spirits book of all time?
Oh, I believe I'm about to name a Random House book. I really love The Smoke and the Smell by Thad Vogler. In my opinion, there's not enough spirits books that are just words without pictures or recipes. So I lean towards those. I love that. I love Robert Simonson's Proper Drink, Liquid Intelligence by Dave Arnold. Those are
great books. We've had Robert on the show, and a terrific writer like yourself. And I really like his new book too, the kind of A to Z of cocktails.
Yeah, he's a friend, but I'd always read his books even if I didn't know him.
Yeah. Let's talk about a favorite recent spirits book discovery.
There's this guy, Matt Petrek. He's briefly mentioned in my book. He's a rum expert, and he wrote, photographed, and self-published last year an 800-page book that must weigh about 50 pounds called Modern Caribbean Rum. It is the most authoritative text on Caribbean rum. You need a giant table to read it. It's like when you go to a funeral and you have to sign in. It's on that stand. Like, you can't just hold this book in your lap. It's so heavy. But it was really a labor of love for him, and quite frankly, a crazy move, because from what I understand, he put like his entire family's nest egg into producing it, but it paid off. I think he won a Spirited Award for it, and it's sold pretty well.
It's selling,
it's a indispensable book if you care about rum.
Wow. That guy.
You should have him on.
Needs to be on the podcast. Way to sell his book. That's you're great. You're terrific. This is good. Get you on Terry Gross. Come on, let's do this. All right, a few more. A favorite city outside America to visit for food and drink?
I only went once, and not in 10 years, but I went on my honeymoon. San Sebastian, Spain, which was like just incredible. The pinchos. There's lots of good drinking culture there, whether they're local ciders or wine. The cocktails weren't that great back then. I'm sure they've improved, but just a magical place to eat and drink.
A spirit you would like to learn more about?
Probably the hardest spirit is mezcal, because there's so just kind of insular practices, and there's not that many big brands. Virtually impossible for conglomerates to own these things. So it's real inscrutable in many ways, and I always learn things about it, and I can't imagine ever mastering it.
Yeah, it's remarkable when you see it made too in person.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
One of those things that you hear about it, but then you see it and you're like, wow, this is like no joke, especially with the agriculture being so like agave. It's such an incredible process.
Yeah, it really harkens back to kind of what I'm talking about in the book, to a way spirits are simply not made anymore, except in, the Oaxaca area with mezcal.
Last one, your favorite sandwich?
Got to be the Reuben.
Nice. Do you have a favorite place to get it?
But the funniest thing is, like, I love Reubens. Well, I think most people love Reubens, but it's not like a weekly sandwich, because you kind of feel like disgusting.
It's not your day-to-day.
Right. So, like, anytime I see a Reuben on a menu, I'm like, oh, Reuben. And then I just order something like lamer.
Yeah,
so I really don't eat a lot of Reubens, but I don't know. Do you have a favorite Reuben?
I don't really. There's a veggie Reuben in Madison, Wisconsin that I still remember about, and we wrote a piece about veggie Reubens. So to me, it's not my favorite sandwich, but the veggie Reuben is its own category, because it takes the best parts of the Reuben, Swiss cheese, Thousand Island, caramelized onions, rye, and takes out that fucking meat, which is personally kind of gross.
What's kind of weird, my college like dining hall served a turkey Reuben, which I remember as being very good.
Yeah.
And kind of leads to maybe you being correct, even though I would say I love like pastrami and corned beef and whatnot.
Totally.
But, maybe you need that on just a simpler sandwich. So maybe that's not my favorite sandwich. Maybe you've talked me out of it.
And I'm thinking sauerkraut, of course. Sorry, I said caramelized onions, but I think
maybe I'll switch to the Cuban.
Oh, sick! I'm not judging. Listen, Aaron, you can say what you want on this.
Forget opening a bar. I always thought it'd be good to open a food truck called Cubans and Reubens, the two best sandwiches.
Two favorite, and then it's Cubans and Reubens : the two best sandwiches.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah.
What are you up to next? Do you have a book in the works?
No, this is like the first time in 8 or 9 years that I haven't been contracted to write something. I'm usually like promoting the current book while working on the next book, which is nice as a person who only earns money when he writes and sells things. But I don't have anything right now. This took a little bit out of me, so I'd like to sell something.
Definitely. We'll enjoy the book, and I love it so much, Dusty Booze. Aaron Goldfarb, thank you so much for joining This Is Taste.
Thank you. It was fun.
This Is Taste is hosted by Eliza Abarbanel and me, Matt Rodbar. The show is produced by Shalia Harris and Pat Stango and edited by Clayton Gumbert. Theme music by Steve Rydell. Visit Taste online at tastecooking.com. And make sure to subscribe to our newsletter for updates on all cool things that are happening.